Hi, I'm Erin, and I'm here with...
My name is Matt Gunderson. I'm Secondary Science Consultant.
And we're here to kind of put a science spin on this idea of teaching reading in the classroom, how to make the data from the reading screeners relevant to science teachers in junior high. First question for you. How important is reading when it comes to junior high science?
It's important for everything, and if you kind of think about it, just specifically for science, it just leads to higher cognitive activities. There's so many kind of labs that we do in science land that it just kind of leads to other things like science fairs and just imagination that goes on. If you kind of look at the lab activities as well, there's reading that they have to do about safety as well, or being concerned about like women's symbols. And one of the things that I always did was having students actually reading lab procedures, just because students would come up to me, "What do I do now?" and be like, "Go read the procedure." And so they would actually have to read the procedure, partly because the variables, controlled, manipulated, and responding, are found inside the procedures. So it's really important.
Yeah. I mean, like, the thing about I think a science classroom, this is like from a complete outsider's perspective, what a junior high science class looks like, labs being a very kind of active and kind of classroom, versus whatever you call the non-lab part, which is what, like note-taking? Yeah, and I think in that section, like, it's kind of like reading must be important there, especially like reading out loud or reviewing, like that kind of thing.
Whether you are teacher directing or you're a little bit more interactive, you're using words, and students have to recognize those words and what those words mean.
Yeah, I mean, a common theme, like I'm realizing with these interviews with all the different subject area consultants, is that communication is like a key part of like a lot of curriculums, right? So I think that is just a truth, right? We're always having to come back to words. When you're talking about going back and forth between like labs and notes, so for example, and I'm thinking, wouldn't that depend on like the kind of classroom a teacher has? Like if they have access to that kind of the lab, I don't know what you call the lab space. Is it called lab space?
Lab space? The classroom?
Well, like, no, like with the sinks and the gas. And
the lab. Yeah, the counters. Yeah.
So, like, if you don't have that, because I know that there are some teachers who are teaching in all sorts of weird places right now, right?
There are some class spaces where it's just a normal classroom, and so to do like a lab activity, the teachers would have to go to usually the main science lab there or the prep room and set things up and then bring it back to their classroom. That can be an obstacle, and that might be one extra hurdle for teachers to do. But whether that's doing during the prep or as they are right before doing the activity, it doesn't mean that students can't sit there and actually do some sort of reading activity. My favorite author, Bill Bryson, 2 books that are really good for across junior high science that he does is called The Body, and the other one is called A Short History of Everything.
What are some other obstacles, I guess, that exist in the
probably the big thing in science is those tiered level words. So science has tons of tier 3 words.
Right.
And we think of homozygous, if you want to go into a little bit more high school, but heterogeneous, what does that mean? Or other kind of terms that we have like that. And science is full of it, especially biology. It's full of all those different terms there. So that's a big hurdle when it comes to reading. And so how can we strategize with that? And just breaking down what that word means is typically what I love to do, but there are other strategies as well. Another big one is tier 2 words. And in science, it's mainly the directing words. And so students a lot of time will have misunderstandings of what to do, like identify. Do they really know what that means? Or one that I see quite a bit is evaluate. We assume they know what that means, but do they actually know what that means?
Yeah, and then there's the added challenge of like sometimes a word means something different in a different context. Like a tier 2 word would be like compound, right? Pretty common word, I imagine. But in an English classroom, that would refer to a compound sentence, where I'm thinking, is it a thing in science?
Exactly. You got ionic compounds and molecular compounds, but then same thing. Another word that comes to mind is solution. Math class means finding an answer.
Solution to a problem. Yeah.
So that's confusing as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the thing is, it's about, I guess, acknowledging the potential confusion and then teaching through it, right? Saying like in science, this means that. And yeah, in English or math, it might mean something else. And that's correct. But in this context right now, we're talking about that.
And it's really important for like ELLs because it could get so confusing so fast.
I would consider this a problem, but I don't know if it is universally considered this, is like science is taught as fact when like science is also always changing. So how could those things both be true?
Back in the I'm dating myself here, 1930s to 1950s.
You were born in the 1950s.
Yeah, right. But way back then, science was all about rote learning and memory and stuff like that. And then it wasn't until like the 1980s that we started seeing that science can change. And if you look at the textbook, even the textbook that we have is from 2004. There's information inside there that is just old information. Science is always evolving, and I always like to say that there's a stronger linear relationship between social and science than there is in science and math. Just because things are always
an evolution.
Yeah,
that's super interesting.
Yeah.
So I mean, but I guess that would be something I wonder if science teachers are accustomed to doing, is like teaching students to read with skepticism, or teaching students to read and recognize when things aren't up to date. Like, how is a kid supposed to do that?
That critical thinking piece, a lot of time that's missing, where students, they have an opinion of how something works, but then they don't explore it more. And so like using like newspaper articles, and go find an article that says a pro about this, or go find a newspaper article that says a con about this, and then what's your take on it then? Why do you think that? It does come back into comprehending about what's occurring in the curriculum and what's happening in their world.
Because there is a lot of science news, I think, and
constant.
Yeah,
always. Yeah.
Like that kind of comes to like the collective consciousness, and then can be misinterpreted, I think, is another huge aspect of that. But it's kind of one challenge that was brought up by the social studies consultant was, when we're looking for these current affairs kind of articles or resources, they are very rarely written for 13-year-olds. Like, and I would imagine in science, maybe more than any other subject, the academic literature is very difficult to understand.
I find a lot of articles, or a lot of ones that I do use in the classroom, comes from CBC. But if you take something like the Globe and Mail, yeah, that's a little bit more higher level.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess that could be another potential opportunity for a reading strategy in science, would be accessing those more difficult to read articles, not forcing a kid to wade through it, but teaching them how to kind of glean whatever information they can from it to apply to whatever it is they're learning. Because that's, again, also a reading strategy.
Well, like even something like the textbook or a news article or something like that, you quickly scan things to kind of get a glimpse of what the article is about, and that's where you start asking questions. And you start developing your opinion that way.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, the same process, I guess, that we as teachers go through to choose those articles for our classes, scanning, headline, checking references, checking author. Those are things we can also teach students, to like read like scientists or
totally.
Or any units or outcomes in junior high science that explicitly mention reading?
If you look at the skills for the curriculum, yes. And there's actually two, if you actually look at under performing and recording. Just to kind of read off screen here, under the performing and recording, students will conduct investigations into the relationships between and among observations and gather and record, blah, 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 but select and integrate information from various print and electronic sources. So that explicitly says reading right there, right? Same thing with communication and teamwork, where it says students will work collaboratively, but also use appropriate vocabulary. And that's where it comes into the tier 2 and tier 3. What do we want students to actually want to do?
Yeah. So those are kind of the, I guess, outcomes we're building a student towards all year, right? Like, and expect them to kind of be at their peak ability of it by the end of the course, or at certain parts of the course.
Those two curriculars and all the skill ones are always circular. So in every unit they should be doing that stuff anyways.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting to think about that. And I mean, this is something that I'm starting to think of the LA curriculum this way, is to say by the end of the course, a student was better at reading science texts than they were in September.
Right.
And that's something that is kind of, I guess, implicit in those outcomes, but maybe never made explicit by the teacher. Or
And to be fair as well, when we're saying reading, we don't necessarily mean the textbook, because the textbook really is, for a lot of students, above their reading level. And so if it's above their reading level, it's above their comprehension level. The thing about the science textbook is that it's, again, just outdated.
It's an interesting point, though, to say that like we put this book in front of the kids, but we know it's too difficult for them, right? And I think that that's another opportunity just for like more reading strategies, and to say this is the information, but it's not presented in like a way that is accessible,
user friendly.
Yeah, right. And how do you deal with that? Because again, I think that's pretty typical of like when we're looking for information to kind of pick and choose.
And that's where I always did over the years, actually find storybooks about like the curriculum.
Yeah.
And I remember one year a grade 9 student, as they were leaving the school, said, here's like a nice storybook for you that I got from Chapters. It was all about genetics. It was all grade 9 unit A, dealing with DNA and genetics and everything, but it was a nice, beautiful storybook for him that really was written for like grade 7s. There is stuff that is out there.
Yeah. So, writing.
Does writing happen in science? Yeah, it does. So obviously there is the note-taking part, and depending on each school site, how they approach it is going to be different. But we also do science labs as well. There is the scientific method. You got your problem hypothesis and all that. But you also have to know how to write lab reports. And going into the next phase of students' lives in high school, it's expected that they know how to do this and they know the scientific method.
Reading and writing are complementary, right? But I think that level of writing is pretty high level.
What we do in junior high is that a lot of times we'll have a template for them to follow, and so follow along and break down what we want them to do. It could go either way.
Yeah, because a template is reassuring for those students who don't know where to start, but it's also can be limiting because then you're not getting as much of that like critical thinking.
Which comes to get that imagination back, science fairs. There is that relationship between English and science where they have to build something for a board and actually have to put words on the board there. And then they have to use their imagination of what they're going to build.
Right. That's like the synthesis kind of aspect of what they're doing.
Graphic organizers, the FRER model. Yeah. I really liked using that with English language. Oh, wait. EAL.
Yeah.
The FRER model comes in handy in science as well.
And that's, I think, like the UDL aspect of teaching reading, right? What's good for the student who struggles is good for everybody.
Right.
The thing, too, about the FRER model, and this came up with another consultant, is like, this is something that is a tool that a student has to have time and develop skills, right, to be able to master it. And so I think sometimes it can be tempting to look at that graphic organizer, them that take up a whole page, as something to collect and assess, but that's not really going to help a student master that tool, right? That they just need multiple attempts at it all the time, ongoing.
I think the other thing, too, that we have to be careful as science teachers, as teachers as whole, is that we have to respect the student's privacy a little bit. If a student is getting like a worksheet with the FRER model on it and other students are not, is that an embarrassing situation? Are we helping or are we hindering that situation?
What are some ways that a science teacher can start to kind of work those things into their lesson?
If I kind of think about like just biology and so terminology, right? And so the strategy that I've always done is that take that word and actually break it down. What does it mean? So for example, geo always means earth, but breaking down the words I always found to be a great strategy.
As like a reader myself, that's something that I would almost do automatically if I encountered a word that I didn't know. And I think that like, being like intelligent people who chose education as a vocation, that's probably another strategy that we might have done just without being explicitly told. So I think that kind of thing, breaking words down, that you might have people in your class, like the keener kids who are like, oh, I figured that out already. And then you might think to yourself as a teacher, okay, cool, I don't need to do it. But it's the kids who aren't talking to you that need it broken down.
And I think that's an assumption with a lot of science teachers a lot of time, that it's just assumed that students know how to read.
Yeah.
And so it's just, we just take it for granted. We know that there's a lot of a lot of students just really struggle with just like, what does that word mean?
Yeah. What I found in English is that a student will often choose to use a word that is easier to spell because they don't want to look stupid by misspelling a more complicated word. And so you think they don't have the vocabulary, but you hear them say it. They just refuse to write it. In science, they wouldn't have a choice. And so in that case, if a kid has to make the choice between, okay, if I spell this wrong, I look stupid, versus if I don't do it, I'll just look like I made a choice to not try, right? And then we kind of slide into like, okay, the student's like being unmotivated or lazy, but really it is tied to reading. It's just kind of manifesting in a different way.
I've helped students with is that exact thing where students, they just don't know what the word is or how they don't want to look it up. So what I did last year was, I was also the woodshop teacher as well. I actually made chalkboards, nice long chalkboards, and actually put the word on there and broke down what the word means and stuff like that. And students would look up during tests and stuff and actually see what that word is. And word balls are nice that way, but the other thing that we have to be careful of, especially in science labs, is that how much stuff are we putting on the wall?
And how flammable is it? And
how flammable it is, right? And that's a big thing in science. You have to be purposeful of what you're putting on the wall. Interactive word balls I've seen as well, especially for like grade 7, the plants unit. Somebody put something on the wall, a little bit of dirt in a Ziploc bag, and started to plant grow, and then they actually started making a word wall out of that. It was actually kind of neat. I don't know, you got a plant and then word stemming on the side there.
Oh, I see, okay.
And that's, it just kind of took off.
It has the object at its center. Oh, that's super interesting.
I actually have like a book club. So beyond using the textbook, I actually ordered books that are very specific for science. That are not textbooks, but they're storybooks and stuff. There would be the key terms and stuff like that, and I would actually have sometimes students kind of one-on-one or in little groups there read like the chapter inside the book, but other times I would do like read alouds. And so I would actually read it, I would have it projected on the board there if students want to follow. Some students, they wanted to follow. Other students, I challenged them a little bit that actually listen to what the words are saying and actually draw things out. And then afterwards, then I would give them the text or part of the text there and actually say, what are these words from the Fryer model, or what vocab words can you pick out inside there?
Like modeling reading is something that I would want to challenge every teacher to do. Personally, like the longer I've been teaching, the better of like a storyteller type reader I've become. It's like in English, like speaking and listening are skills that we're supposed to develop, you know? But the point of that is communication, which again underpins so many of the other curriculums, to really focus on like how you're using punctuation to inform your expression. Because that is something that we expect of English students in an LA class, but it is also going to increase the comprehension of your students who are EAL or just struggling with reading. Like hearing someone react to a period and like they know what it does means they're more likely to understand it. Or a heading, explaining to a student, when I read this graph, I read the title, then I go down and I read the caption, then I read the axes. Just going through those steps over and over and over again means that a student will be more likely to do that independently.
I think that's a lot of things that we assume as science teachers, that they just know how to do it. It's assumed that science teachers are going to teach how to do a graph. And the math teacher is going to assume that the science teacher is going to do that, but the science teacher is assuming that the math teacher is going to do that. And
the trick is, if we all do it, the kid's more likely to remember.
That's right.
Because they're not going to get it the first time. You say it once.
That's right.
So what are things that you would recommend maybe letting go of in favor of bringing in more of these like explicit reading strategies?
Have to stop thinking as silos, and kind of what we're doing here right now is actually talking out and branching out to other subjects, whether it's English, whether it's math, whether it's social. We've got to kind of stop talking like we're a silo. And in some schools you might be the only science teacher. In other schools they have like a slightly little bit more advantage that they have 2 or 3 that they can work together. But again, being like in education, we're not just technically science teachers. We're like so that's the big thing. The other kind of thing that I would probably say is that if you look at the program of studies, the programs of studies say students will. It does not say the teachers will. So if you kind of reframe your thinking that students will do this, it makes them a little bit more independent into what they are doing. And then, I mean, for me, it's always we want them to, but it will never happen the first time. Or if it does, it's with the kid who didn't need me in the first place. That's right.
Right? So it's just giving them as many opportunities as they can to get to that place of independence.
That's right.
That's it. So thank you. You all had no choice, but thank you for taking the time.
I didn't have a choice either.
So you didn't either. To be fair, I forced you.